I'm Gowrie, and years ago, before many of you were born, I was chairman of the Serpentine Gallery. And even before that, I helped fund it as the Minister for the Arts. And later I became chairman of the Arts Council, so I had to step down, rather sadly, from the Serpentine Gallery as the Arts Council funded it. And that would be a clash of interest. But now, very happily, as a neighbour and consumer and one who walks their dog here and comes to exhibitions, I'm back with a great friend and wonderful individual, Julia Peyton-Jones, who I'm very proud to say years ago, under my chairmanship, became the boss, the director of the Serpentine Gallery. And here she still remains, and Julia and I are going to talk about the arts and London, because I'm now an honorary advisor to the London magazine, and the London magazine keeps an eye on the arts as well as publishing new poems and short stories. So Julia, you're a young woman to me, but you're a considerable survivor. You've been in post longer than most. How's it been?
Well, firstly, I was so thrilled to be asked to be director of the Serpentine, and I suppose one could say I was a surprise appointment. I wasn't the front runner, but luckily the appointment board, did appoint me, and it was a time when the arts were just really beginning to develop in this country. Frieze, the extraordinary exhibition that Damien Hirst and his pals curated, that really produced a significant sea change in how the arts were looked at in this country and outside it, both the work of artists but also the kind of reception about contemporary art. It really made such an extraordinary contribution. I took over something like 3 years after that show, and it was different days, as you know all too well, and there were no collectors here. The museum
well, there was Charles.
There was Charles, exactly, but apart from
Saatchi,
Charles Saatchi, Janet de Botton, who were the principally, of course Doris Saatchi as well, but they were very, very few and far between. Whereas now there are so many collectors, there are so many galleries, there are so many artists. The power of the institution, I think, has waned, relatively speaking. But what's so interesting is that the appetite for culture and the arts is so strong by the public, and also really so well covered by the press. So the change has been nothing but good. So I've been unbelievably fortunate to be at the Serpentine during this whole period and seen it from both inside and also as a consumer, because of course I go to shows all the time. So it's been a kind of revolution without bloodshed.
It's a rather extraordinary and in a way a very kind of contradictorily English story that a place in a royal park that my parents' generation would have associated with nannies with charges in prams, exchanging gossip over tea, should now be a centre not merely of the London, but of the world avant-garde in visual art. And you have a very great responsibility for this. You were one of the people who made this. To what extent did you have to fight against a culture, or to what extent were you putting your surfboard on a wave that was already there?
Well, thank you for your very kind remarks. I suppose the answer is a bit of both. The change in the culture I always put down to the Frieze exhibition that was organised by the Goldsmith students and others in the late 80s, which the leading protagonist was Damien Hirst, of course an artist of international acclaim. And that really changed how the art world, and indeed what later became the public, saw contemporary art. And what those soon-to-be ex-students, when they were showing their work, did was to prove that you didn't need a commercial gallery, you didn't need a museum. You could organise an exhibition yourself, you could take matters into your own hands and be kind of master of or mistress of your own domain. that taught me an incredibly significant lesson, because when, as you will all remember all too well, when I came to the Serpentine, the culture in this country was really not for contemporary. It was looking more backwards. There was still an overwhelming respect and affection and desire for brown furniture and what Cy Twombly calls brown paintings. And the idea of embracing the culture of our time and the objects of our time was really less evident. And that all began to sort of move and change in the most interesting way. And the Serpentine, my appointment here, thanks to you, was really part of that change. What the institution contributed to it, and therefore me as director, obviously, I was part of it. But it was a kind of a change in the zeitgeist, and that's what made it so interesting. And so people, the public, after all, we're a public gallery, we exist for the public to come and see our work. We don't do it in a vacuum. And we have now over 1 million visitors a year, so it's, you know, a lot. And we don't charge admission, and the reason we don't charge admission is because we're public and we want there to be nothing to inhibit anybody of any age or social demographics to be able to come here. Those kind of opportunities are extraordinary. In addition to which, when I took over, there were a massive number of artists who would be seen on an international stage, as a matter of course, at the great museums of the world, their work hadn't been seen in this country. So it was a kind of incredible opportunity to say, you may have read about this artist, or maybe not, but these are the people that there is an appetite to know more about all over the world, but who are just not well known here. So in the early days, I took over a program that from the outset had included the work of Jasper Johns, Giacometti, Willem de Kooning, and many other distinguished artists, alongside emerging artists. The institution was run by the Arts Council, where of course you became chairman, and only opened the summer months because it had no heating. And then it changed gradually into a place where museum loans could be given. We could do museum shows if we wanted to, but also we could be entirely experimental and show artists who really were at the very beginning of their careers. And I always found that to be a fantastic spread, just on the need-to-know basis, you know. And that's really what's informed my thinking about the programme here, and indeed how the discussions with colleagues, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, who's now co-director, and Jochen Volz, who's head of programmes, when we're thinking about the programme, it's always a balance and a mix, both of internationalism and many other considerations. But it's a kind of fascinating field, and I feel very fortunate.
There has, of course, also been an interesting demographic wave on which to put your surfboard. Because, again, if I go back to my parents' generation or my own childhood, Kensington, this part of London, was a very cosy, stable haunt of the middle and upper middle class, English. Now it is a centre of well-off people from all over the world.
Yeah. It's
really, in an interesting way, rather ceased to be English. And you as a gallery are not simply showing English artists. In fact, I'd like you to show rather more of them, but that's another matter. So what was happening in the visual arts, to some degree, was happening in this part of London, which has become a world centre, not only for art and for the avant-garde, but for business, finance. It's one of the 3 or 4 major centres of this planet, which causes, as I, as an old or former government minister knows, some problems and tensions, and is liable to continue doing so. I'd still rather have it than not. I think to have this small offshore island as a global centre in a number of fields, as well as in visual arts, is a fantastic plus.
Yes.
And that we should deal with the grumbles as best we can, but not try to obliterate them. And presumably this ties in with your work a bit, because you're funded by the government through the Arts Council, and you're therefore, as it were, like a civil servant, but you have been very successful in raising large sums of private money. Can you talk to us a bit about this mix of public and private funding? Is it working? Is it under strain? How is it?
Well, there are many questions in there, in a way. One is the absolute, I think, essential importance that England should be part of an international perspective, and that's happened. So that job is done. What's interesting is that our highest level donors in the region of about 55 come from 23 different countries. But
55 in numbers of donors.
55 yes, numbers of donors, and 50% of them come from 23 different countries. Yes. That is an extraordinary statistic when you think that these people are very often here temporarily. Some have moved here on a long-term basis. But the arts is now supported, or the arts are now supported by probably in the minority the English, and the majority people who are resident here and who understand why it's essential to support organisations like the Serpentine and others, many others. So this is a very, very big change, because when I came here that just simply didn't exist at all, and government funding was a principal support of institutions all over the country. What I found when I came was that we didn't have enough money to do what we wanted to do. So it was a very, very simple decision. You either went out and raised more money so that you could do the programme you wanted, or you lived within your means. So I thought it was more interesting to go out and raise the money. And then we began to be reasonably successful about it. And so now we raise £6 million a year without charging admission, which is a huge amount of money. So to answer your question, it's very, very difficult. People or institutions outside London find it extremely difficult, and they think that in London it's much easier. Well, I'm sure that is the case, but it is very, very, very tough. And you know, the thing that I worry most about is money. Whether we have enough, whether we can raise it, whether we can live within our means. So that is a very considerable pressure.
What's the ratio? You say you raise about £6 million a year privately. What kind of proportion do you get from the public?
From government via the Arts Council, London 15%, 1.5. So it's very, very low.
You get 15% of £6 million, I mean.
No, we get 15. We get 50. If for the 100% of the budget, 15% comes from Arts Council London.
Right.
So it's very proportionately low.
Yes.
And the figures of £6 million is a lot.
And it's been falling, is it?
No, it's been, well, it's wavered between, no, the fall is minimal, it's at 1%.
Yes.
And of course we've opened another building, so that increases our costs, and that was our choice. We didn't have to do that. But when the opportunity of this building came up, it was like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and I should explain that we took over 5 minutes from the Serpentine an 1805 building that was formerly a store for ammunition, and converted it. Zaha Hadid designed an extension called the Magazine, which is a restaurant and social space, and she also renovated the gallery and made it possible for us to show art. And we are now virtually on our first anniversary, so it's extremely exciting. So our programmes, which are exhibitions, architecture, design, education and public programmes, they continue, and so the pavilion is still at the Serpentine. So everything we did there we continue to do.
Would you say that your government money, as it were, conforms to some of your social and outreach programmes, what you do for the public educationally, and your private money is important for the huge costs of shipping and looking after international exhibitions? Is it that sort of ratio, or not as easy as that?
Really, the Arts Council money goes to core costs,
yeah.
So staffing and lighting.
Yeah.
And then we raise the money for all the rest of the work that we do. So that's a broad division.
And you've got the Mayor of New York, the former Mayor of New York, no less, Michael Bloomberg, as your chairman, and that makes a bit of a an international point, does it not?
Well, of course it does. I mean, you know, we're incredibly lucky. Our distinguished chairman, present, and most importantly past, have been so important to how the gallery is obviously governed and also directed. Mike Bloomberg was a trustee in the late 90s, and so we've known him for a very long time, and he in fact sponsored the first exhibition following the renovation of the, so to speak, old Serpentine Gallery, which was by the artist Piero Manzoni, which was a museum show curated by Germano Celant, and the first time that Manzoni had a show in this country, just endorsing what I was saying before about showcasing artists.
Which is extraordinary to think of, because Manzoni, you know, I'm in my 70s, Manzoni is an artist of my generation, or even just earlier. You know, I knew Manzoni's work when I was young. So that was overdue.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but the privilege was, and the fun too, was having this array of possibilities and being able to make a program that reflected all the amazing artists, principally living, but some who are not, and being able to show their work.
Yes, it's a very exciting. I mean, a seminal thing to me, you mentioned the Frieze exhibition, that's absolutely right. But I think the first Saatchi collection, which I think Doris Lockhart had, then married to Charles, had a huge amount to do so, was a very great collection. And one of the blows, and life is full of blows, to me, was that I was told when I worked for the public that there was a chance of that coming into the public realm. That was the first collection of roughly late 60s, 70s American minimal art. My fave, Agnes Martin, was there, and Donald Judd and others. And certainly, I thought the first Saatchi gallery in St. John's Wood, done up by Max Gordon brilliantly, the late lovely Max. For some reason we used to always say Max Warden, the traffic warden. I can't remember why. But Max did it brilliantly. Was at that time the best showing space for modern art in Britain, I thought.
Unquestionably.
And when you did up the Serpentine here and extended it, I was very pleased that it had a slightly Gordonic note. It was plain and a good place to see paintings with, of course, plein air, with the light, which is such luck, better light than St. John's Wood. But that was a great chance, and when, with the marriage breaking up and with a crisis in the financial world, that collection went, I thought huge opportunities were lost, and all credit to Charles Saatchi to remake it round the new kids on the block, many of whom were British. But that was the greatest collection of American art of that period anywhere. And it interested me that the only other rival to it was Count Panza's. So two Europeans actually made collections of that period of American art. Curators in America at the time were quite conservative also. They wanted messy painting, which I like best too, but you know, that's what they wanted. But that's wonderful to have happened. I want to move a little bit to the aegis of your longest serving chairman, and something you share with him, which is a passion for architecture. That's my old friend and mentor in many ways, Peter Palumbo. When I was a small boy at a rather bullying school, Peter was kind to me and talked to me about painting. So, you know, he's a hero of mine ever since. And he and you have made a great impression, I think, on British architecture. And the way you've done this was in your annual pavilions. And I remember suggesting pavilions, but I can't take any credit for your pavilions, because what I had in mind was adding to our revenue by having a rather pretty kind of metal tents that people could have cocktail parties in. In other words, it was for the dosh. Where you've got a social space which also showcases international architecture, and some people would say that your architectural exhibitions through your pavilions have made even more dent than your art shows. Can you talk a bit about you and Peter in this context?
Yes. Well, Peter indeed is an inspiration to all of us, because as chairman of the Pritzker Prize for Architecture, which is of course the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for literature or other disciplines, he really understands the importance. So there was no persuading to do. What we wanted to do was to show architecture, and exhibitions of models and drawings and photographs are on the whole very difficult to read. So there was this consideration, how to make an architect's work legible, plus the fact that for our 30th anniversary, you will remember the gala dinners we held with the Princess of Wales, yes, and Vanity Fair in these glorious tents that Vanity Fair commissioned, which were expensive. And when the Princess, our patron, died and Vanity Fair were no longer our sponsor, for our 30th anniversary, we were kind of stuck about what we were going to do. So I hit on the idea of commissioning Zaha Hadid, who at that time was very well known in the architectural world but not known to the general public. Asked her whether she would design a structure in which this dinner could be held, which she then did. And Chris Smith came to it, who was then Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport.
And a very good Secretary of State.
Yes, brilliant, yes, absolutely brilliant. I mean, a beacon for us all. And I asked him whether this structure could stay up for the summer, because the Royal Parks were a little resistant to us having anything on the lawn, which they felt was not the right thing for us to be doing. And he, because the Royal Parks came under his wing, said yes. And so the beginning of the programme was made, but in a way that was organic rather than coming up with the idea and then sort of sitting down and insisting on it. And that was really, I don't think anybody would have been, I certainly wouldn't have been brave enough to say, okay, we're going to build a structure every year. Because of the economy, we have no money to make it, literally not £1. We have to sell it to contribute to the cost of it, which means dismantling it, finding a buyer and transporting it and getting it re-erected. This is quite a sort of tall order. But that 30th anniversary event and structure was the beginning of then what followed. And we're now in the 14th year. It is about exhibiting architecture. We work with architects in exactly the same way as we do with artists. They're paid the same commissioning fee. We don't have a competition, so we look at the possibilities and choose. You choose them. We choose them.
Yes.
And then we work with them in a curatorial capacity to shape their design, so it's within budget for us, and also so that we think it's going to display their work to the best possible advantage. It is a fantastic project to do. I cannot tell you the pleasure it gives me, which is very fortunate. It's a great thing to work on, because we're making something. And the reason it's an interesting, it's like doing a new wing every year, really, basically. But the good thing is, depending on your point of view, is that it goes away again. So there are architects such as Oscar Niemeyer, the great Brazilian modernist, or Frank Gehry.
Ai Weiwei. Yeah,
yes, Ai Weiwei with Herzog de Meuron,
yes,
who of course did the Bird's Nest in Beijing for the yes, Olympics. Sana, who Sejima was the curator of the Architecture Biennale, Rem Koolhaas, and so on. But the point of this programme is that when we installed the pavilion on our lawn, there was no building of these architects in this country. And unfortunately, it's still true to say that some of the architects are still not built. But it means that over a 3 or 4 month period, the public can come and see their work. They can enter it, they can engage with it, they can move the furniture around, they can jog in it, they can go to parties in the evening in it, they can come to our park nights, lectures and film screenings and so on. They can really use it. These structures are incredibly well used.
Did you say you sold them on?
Yes, we sell them.
You get, as it were, you pay a commission, but you're effectively given them by the architects, are you?
We pay for all the costs of making them.
Making them.
but we pay a stipend,
yes.
which in in our terms is peanuts.
You're right.
And
then you can sell them and retain the proceeds of the sale for
yes.
the next one, as it were.
Exactly.
And plough back.
So the sale doesn't cover any more than 40% of the costs, ever.
Where, for example, is your fine Gowrie pavilion?
That has been installed in the south of France.
Right.
It was bought by a private collector, and it's been installed as part of the winery in the south of France.
Oh, terrific.
Which is fantastic. There are quite a lot of pavilions in the south of France. The Luma Foundation have also bought a number. Last year's pavilion, the this year's pavilion, Smiljan Radic Pavilion, is going to go to Somerset as part of Ivan Worth's incredible complex there that he's conceived, which is an art gallery, a restaurant, and the pavilion will be sited there. So they've gone all over the world. England, Ireland, Europe, the Middle East. None have gone to America yet.
Yes.
So the...
And you think this tradition now of the Serpentine, which you, Peter, inaugurated, and your admirable board, and by the way, one of the things I think you've done extremely well is to keep good people on the board for quite a long time. There's a feeling that it's more democratic to change people over, but if you want to achieve stuff, get some continuity.
Absolutely.
By all means, have rolling seats, but you want some fixed chairs once you've got the right bots in them, in my view.
I agree.
But you see this bedding in like your exhibitions. You would hope that both you and your successors would continue this, or do you think it's inevitably expensive and difficult and might be short-lived as a tradition?
Well, I hope. I mean, nothing is forever. It will. The scheme, the project will inevitably change, and it should. We've recently started working with younger architects. So the architect this year is 49. Last year's was 41. And the reason we didn't work with younger architects earlier is this pressure to sell, which is really an essential financial requirement. We weren't confident that we would be able to find buyers for architects who are not known. Well, as it is in the last 2 years, we have, but there is always only one person every year who wants to buy the pavilion. So it's quite, it's quite high risk,
yes.
And requires some nerve. But if the board hadn't been as brave as they had been, this programme would never have existed. And so, it's terrific that it does.
And you could, to some degree, try to find your buyer before the thing goes up.
Sometimes we sell them from plan. Sometimes yes. we've had really hair-raising moments where the pavilion's been up. Basically, the pavilion goes up probably the very end of June, beginning of July, 1st of July, and we have to sell it before the 1st of August because then people go away on holiday. Yes. But more recently, we've had an idea about who to sell it to. And the decision is made by Hans-Ulrich Obrist, the co-director, Jochen Volz, and myself. And it's a very difficult decision. And we decide, we really look at it, we return to it, we redecide, we redebate. And so, but it's a process. And
but you're optimistic probably it'll go on for a bit.
Oh gosh, yes. It's absolutely a fixed point in our programme.
Yeah.
It'd be like saying, well, we're not going to do exhibitions anymore. Well, that's not going to happen.
It's made a huge dent. And again, it's very interesting to me that it's in a nice, beautiful trad royal park, that here is this pocket of excitement. And I think that the very fact that it's in a traditional environment has been enormously beneficial to it. And, we must make a nod in this part of London at what an avant-garde and original figure Prince Albert was.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. Astonishing.
A man who's had more effect on modern British culture than practically anyone.
Yes.
Including scientific culture. So yes. I'm a great Albertian.
Yes, me too.
Yeah.
His the Crystal Palace was literally a stone's throw from the Serpentine.
Yes.
And the site of the Great Exhibition, which was so phenomenal. I had the most astonishing number of people every day. So the great in all the discussion about how exhibitions are becoming, you know, a spectator sport and all of that. Yes, but, you know, there's precedents which was even more extreme. And also ideas and objects that were being introduced that are much more radical than probably anything that we could even conceive of today.
I agree. Children say 12 times after me loudly, the Victorians were not stuffy. They weren't. They were a remarkable, confident, innovative culture. And you mentioned earlier some of the tensions that undoubtedly exist between London and the regions and the regional cities, exacerbated now by prospects of devolution and changes in Scotland and so on. But again, we should remember that in the 19th century, the great regional cities were the centres of architectural innovation, high culture, and there are signs of it. I mean, Manchester's vibrant, and there's no doubt that you could have a megalopolis of vibrancy in the Liverpool-Manchester area. And when I was a young man, the effect that Liverpool was having on American culture where I was living, you got proposals of marriage simply if you were British.
Really?
It was as simple as that. Yeah.
How absolutely marvellous.
My Liverpudlian accent just bowled them over.
Great, that's so funny. How absolutely splendid.
So culture is the great international sort of seller for this country. And you're a very important part of it. And in our small way, the London Magazine, which has a very long history, going right back into the 19th century, under its revival and its new admirable proprietor, we're going to make our own small dent as well. I want to go to, before leaving architecture, I want to say something personal, which is, just as I think the loss of the Charles Dorris collection to the nation was a great catastrophe, an even greater one to me was the fact that Peter Palumbo, an admirable and very selfless man, didn't get his Mies van der Rohe project through to the city. And I thought he bore that disappointment, and I'm rather ashamed to be a member of the administration that called it in, completely unnecessary. Because a classic modern, in fact by that time classic rather than modern, Mies was long dead, glass and steel building is very appropriate for the Thames light. In other words, your traditional buildings, St Paul's and the Threadneedle Street, are reflected in it. Your cloudscapes, which the Impressionists crowded into London to paint, are reflected in it. So it's the right architecture in some ways for us. And I thought Peter was very brave, and of course the Sterling building that took its place is a very fine building. But it's a great sadness to me that the Mies building is not there. And I think in a quiet way you're compensating for it a bit with your pavilions. But I want to move on to the sort of art scene. And by the way, when we talk about art, we're talking about the visual arts and the physical arts, the plastic arts. I want to move on from there to the art scene generally. I used to be the London chairman of Sotheby's, and I know therefore very well that London is one of the two centres, two major centres of the art market in the world. That's going to change because it's now totally international, and the Far East, other centres in Europe will rise, but it's a very big player and will remain so. And of course the market is to do with money, and modern art, contemporary art, has become very, very expensive, and it's not easy therefore to get entry-level collectors. When I was young, I could buy some pieces. They were very expensive for me. There was headache and soul-searching and anxiety. I'm not a rich guy, but I could buy them in hundreds if I went without or saved or something like that. You can't now faintly do that, and even indexing my hundreds into lowish thousands you can't. So an entry-level collection of contemporary art, you'd probably, if you wanted to buy 5 pieces, you'd want 150, 200,000 pounds. That's quite a lot. You're talking about sort of serious money, and you might not be able to do it for that. How much has that affected activity? How much is activity in this world rather dependent on some collectors getting in on the ground floor?
I think that's an incredibly good question, because it's all about support and the diversification of support, and the strength of the art world is to have support coming from really a number of different points, a number of different sources. So I suppose architecture, the collection of architectural models or drawings is underexposed or underexplored. But as you say, the visual arts are eye-wateringly, in the main, eye-wateringly expensive. But there is still possible to buy works. A dear friend of mine who I was at the Royal College with in the painting school, called Vanessa Jackson, I went to her exhibition last week, and she was selling large canvases for under £10,000. Now, in my view, severely undervalued, but nevertheless, still, you know, £9,000 is a lot of money.
So degree shows are where collectors and newer and younger collectors go.
Degree shows, I mean, one of the things that is just underscored time and time again is the importance of looking, and looking also in places that are unexpected. There are biennales all over the world. There is not a corner of the world now that doesn't have a biennale or an international exhibition, that doesn't have commercial galleries or the possibility to visit artist studios. It's a kind of unifying umbilical cord that sort of circles the globe, the whole notion of culture. So obviously, the less you have to spend, the harder you have to work. And indeed, the prices that we all know at auction, principally, I think, when I last looked, the highest prices were for Chinese art, contemporary art, but eye-watering sums of money, which is great on the one hand, because it indicates appetite, and appetite means audience. But on the other hand, of course, it creates this imbalance, really, between the public and private sectors. So the role of the public sector, museums and galleries like the Serpentine, used to be very clear what our role was, to inform and educate the public. That still exists. But commercial galleries now are often very large. They often have education spaces. So the whole the boundaries between everything is much more blurred. But the audience is much bigger. If I return to the pavilion, we have more people come and see our pavilions and the Venice Architecture Biennale. So, you know, in the mix, it's all good. But certainly, it's the only unregulated market.
I have one aesthetic anxiety about it, which is that I have observed that the big money is for brands. People want a very recognizable brand, particularly new money, and it's always been new money has come into art. Doesn't tend to be old money. There are notable and honourable exceptions, but in general it's new money. And therefore, high prices are being paid and they're competing with each other. The prices go up,
yes,
and they want something which is recognisably that brand. And the person who really, most brilliantly, invented this is Warhol.
Of course, yes.
I mean, it's really his invention.
Yes.
And I'm all for Warhol, and I thought he was an admirable and interesting artist. And one of the most interesting events of my life, aesthetically, was going round a Warhol exhibition with Francis Bacon, who was a friend at in his last 10 years of his life. And he was absolutely razor-like, what he thought silly and pretty, as he put it, and what he thought had some worth or consequence.
How amazing.
And not unexpectedly, things like the electric chairs or the car crashes were what he went for.
Of course.
You know, but Francis was a man who was very opposed to Matisse on the grounds of being too pretty.
Fascinating.
But it was interesting. But Warhol was definitely a genius visually, and has imprinted our time hugely. It's sort of an age of Daddy Duchamp and son Andy. That's what we're living through. I'd slightly like to get out of it. When I was young, Cézanne was the daddy in significant form, and a kind of trying to get something of the solidity of the perceived world into your works of art. Painters were monkey sculptures, they wanted density. And I miss that in a way. I think the conceptual's gone on rather too long, but that's subjective. But a friend said to me, and this is my question the other day, she said, "Gray, what has happened to the avant-garde?" And I was pointing out to her that it's difficult when the avant-garde becomes the establishment, becomes the academy. I mean, you couldn't be a more respectable, more academic, in a way, artist now than Jeff Koons. The avant-garde, I wouldn't say was Jeff Koons. I suggested to her small, quiet, still painting like Vic and Parsons is. But what do you think, and you're much more in touch with it than me, has happened to the avant-garde? Where is it? It means advanced garde, after all.
Yes.
It means who's Pound said poets are the antennae of the race. Where are the antennae?
I think probably artists who are really engaging with the digital realm, with technology.
Yes.
I think the visual arts have not. We're still dancing around technology a bit. We had a young British artist called Ed Atkins, who was the last exhibition here.
Called what?
Ed Atkins.
Ed Atkins, yeah.
Who is absolutely brilliant. Very young. He's in his very early 30s, and his work is absolutely predicated on, it's the kind of immersion. It has a physical form, it's moving image, you would absolutely recognize it. It has a narrative, but it absolutely is kind of informed, and the underpinnings, the architecture of the work is technology. So that's where I would really say the avant-garde is, and I would also say it's the unexplored area. But it is interesting.
When you say it's using the new technology, let me just pick you up on something there. Does it end up in a viewable, even purchasable object, or is it going to be basically ends up as an experience?
Both.
Both.
But
there will be a thing at the end of it.
Very much a thing.
Yes.
There were lots of things.
Yes.
So what he did a piece called Ribbons, which was one piece on a number of screens with soundtrack, which was displayed at the Serpentine Gallery.
Yes.
In tandem with the Marina Abramovich exhibition. And the pairing was interesting because it's how they both use the body. But what he took as his protagonist, his everyman, was an avatar that he bought off the shelf, that he then customized. And through this avatar, he played with not only technology, because avatars are a technological invention, but also he combined it with...
Explain avatars to the elderly.
An avatar is a kind of fictionalized person that has all the characteristics that you recognize as a person. This was a sort of head and upper body. So eyes, nose, mouth, ears. You absolutely recognize it, but you also know it's not real.
Right.
So it's a digitally conceived person.
It's a sort of upper class robot.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which moves, but moves seamlessly.
Yeah.
So he adapted this avatar and also happens to have a beautiful singing voice. So there were 3 main pieces of music that accompanied it. And the narrative was about this man who had tattoos on his head and on his arm, but looked like a sort of young Jude Law, so very beautiful. You knew he could never be a real person. And this avatar told a story, and he was ruminating on his life. And these ruminations were punctuated by suddenly these flashes of, particularly I think of Hollywood culture, so the film world that would come, punctuating through the storyline, the narrative, with an advertisement that you might have on the big screen, like saying, coming soon, in the sort of typographics. It's absolutely something you could recognise. It also took you back because the music was also historical, but it was profoundly moving. And the reason it was profoundly moving was, the pathos with which this creation, this person in inverted commas, described his life. And it was, and is, because it's still in existence, a fantastic piece. Brilliant.
So in a way there was a literary element to this as well.
100%, and
yes.
Also Ed writes brilliantly.
It was a story.
Yes, it absolutely was a story. Yeah. It was a story that could be followed. But if it had been transposed with a person, a real person, it would never have worked. Never. Because then it would have been a kind of acting thing, and then it would have gone into a different kind of genre. It would have been more like a movie. Yeah. And this was absolutely, resolutely art. So for me, that's where the avant-garde lies. And also it's relatively an unexplored territory. I couldn't agree with you more about the avant-garde in other senses. It's almost impossible to find, because it really is, everything is free jazz, you know. Yeah. Sculptors are filmmakers, writers are poets, and so on. Yeah. Everything kind of meshes together, which is great, because that is somehow how life is now. There's not such clear divisions between things. And also the internationalism helps, because then different cultures feed in. So it is, I think it does feel like uncharted territory, definitely. And luckily I work with people who see and know an incredible amount, and I keep my eyes open, but
is there a kind of rather worrying class division raising between the avant-garde in art, which is very connected with the developed world, and the developing world? There aren't many exhibitions, are there, at the moment? Have I just not been out of touch with them, with African or Indian artists? Well, in this absolute insatiable appetite for culture from the West, there are exhibitions of Indian and African art. We did an exhibition probably about something like six years ago about Indian art. The major museums do it. They also collect it. The Tate has committees that are particularly and solely focused on art from Africa, art from India, so that it's very much part of their collection. Right, yeah. And also council trips, patrons' trips are to Africa, to India. We took our council to Cuba, to Colombia, to Mexico. So this idea about being informed about culture. So you're looking in every corner? Every corner. Yes, that's great. That explains that very well. Julia, most people don't think there's really a glass ceiling where the arts are concerned and where women are concerned these days. And you are a very well-known woman in this field. Nevertheless, most directors still seem to be blokes. Is there a difficulty in getting positions in the international or national museum world here? How's the deputy from my day, Andrea, doing? How is it for women at the moment? It's always very difficult to talk in those generalised terms. It's true to say that the directors of the national museums, which is of course the British Museum, the Tate, the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery, are all men. And there has never, well, there was and the V&A, of course, there was a female director of the V&A, Elizabeth Estef Cole. Yes, a great friend of mine.
Yes,
loved Elizabeth.
Yes, indeed. And but on the whole, they are men. So that is a kind of glass ceiling, definitely. But
is it an imposed ceiling, or have women of that generation, after all, Elizabeth Esteve was sort of nearer my generation than yours, didn't go into that field. Now they probably are going into that field.
Oh yes, I mean the Whitechapel has a woman director, the Camden Art Centre has a woman director, the South London Art Gallery has a woman director. So
it's the nationals.
Yeah, it's the nationals.
They're pushing at the door.
Yes, the nationals. However, you know, in business it is very tough. It's well known to be tough. You know, in politics it's very tough for women. So there are other disciplines or areas where it's much more difficult than it is for women in this. Architecture too. There are very, very few women architects who are absolutely the top of their game. Zaha Hadid and Sejima are exceptions. Amanda Levitt, of course, too, who's doing the
And I would include Patty Hopkins, because
yes, of course,
she's my kind
definitely.
of indivisible as,
yes,
as
exactly.
artists,
yes.
you know, on
yes.
that side.
Incredible.
A wonderful person. Well, keep at it.
Thank you.
Because we need that, and you're a beacon, I think, to your gender as well as to the arts generally. Well, thank you very much for talking to the London Magazine, which in our small but growing way wants to make its own impression on the culture of a great capital city. We have a series called My London, where people just rap in print about their view of the town, and I hope you'll do one.
Thank you.
Along.
Thank you.
It's been a delight to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.